Everyone. You having a good weekend? Good homecoming weekend? We're Truman students, Dr. Barnes. We studied. It's like that's fair. That's fair. Yeah. So exciting stuff going on, but we are moving into a new topic area this week. This is one of the two weeks where I think the topic areas are kind of interesting and exciting. I will do my best to make them not exciting because that's my job, okay, to make things that are really interesting very boring. But all jokes aside, we're talking about blockchain and AI automation. So just for a quick note, we've got three more chapters that we're going to be covering. That are covering this one this week, and then we're going to be covering cybersecurity measures and kind of big overviews of security, information security with respect to that in chapter 14. So those are kind of the two fun ones. But in between that, got internal controls. Okay, we've got internal controls on next week, which I love internal controls, but they are boring and tedious. I made a joke last year. I said I will buy Red Bull for everybody to keep them awake, and then I actually bought Red Bull, and then I did it again in the spring. It is very expensive to keep that habit up. Okay, so I'm not going to buy a whole bunch of Red Bull, especially because not everybody takes a Red Bull, and everybody's just kind of like, I can handle it, Dr. Barnes, and they fall asleep during internal controls. And there you have it. But if you feel that you really, really desperately need some caffeine, like need a shot of Red Bull or something similar to that to stay awake during my lecture next week, let me know. Send me an email. I will get you hooked up. Okay, I'll get you hooked up. I'm not going to do it for the entire class because just when I buy the two cases, I spend $70 on that, and then like half of the case is left, and I'm not going to drink the stuff. So what's going to happen to it? So yeah, the answer is actually goes on the card upstairs, but I'm still not going to go through buying all those cases of Red Bull. Yeah, so after that, we're done with our topics, and then right before Thanksgiving, we got our second exam, so something to keep up on. It doesn't seem like it's that close to the end of the semester, but time flies when you're having fun, I guess. And so today we're going to talk about. I will confess this is a topic area that I am just learning about. I think it's funny because if you want to talk about two topic areas that business instructors are just totally uncomfortable talking about, blockchain and AI are two of those that's just paranoia. And I'm somewhat comfortable about it. I won't say that I know everything. I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm considered to be one of the more knowledgeable in the School of Business faculty. Well, I've done presentations on both of these and some research on both of these, and some School of Business instructors, they're just kind of like, I have to retire because I can't learn this stuff. It's fascinating. But I will say that what I'm going to talk about today is going to scratch the surface. I'm not going to make you an expert on either one of these. You're going to learn some interesting things. What I would recommend, these are areas that are very interesting to you. I actually have two books that I recently read. And then by read, I should probably clarify that I don't read books anymore because I just don't have the time to sit down and read something unless it's student homework. So I actually listen to books. I have a lot of audiobooks. And two that I recently read that were interesting. One was called Going Infinite by Michael Lewis. And for those of you who know who Michael Lewis is, he's the author of Moneyball. So is a very, very well-established author. This book is really interesting. And he was writing this book. It was supposed to be a biography of Sam Bankman-Fried. And so Sam Bankman-Fried was the defunct founder of the now defunct cryptocurrency exchange FTX. And the interesting thing about this book is that it's pretty much the biography, but he was writing this exactly at the time that FTX went bankrupt, or FTX folded and went out of business. So he was there right as everything in real time as events were occurring. And he's got a little bit of a biased view. I will say that there's a lot of criticism. He was on 60 Minutes talking about his defense of Sam Bankman-Fried. It is a little bit of a biased view, but it's very fascinating overall to kind of see the problems. A lot of it is very personal about the life of Sam Bankman-Fried, but there's a lot of business discussion about the nature of crypto exchanges and the nature of crypto assets and the lack of regulation and some of the problems with accounting for this and the business areas. Again, we're not going to get into depth in this, but I think this is a fascinating read if you're looking for something to look into for this topic. This is one that I'd recommend. The other one has to do with artificial intelligence, which is obviously a very, very big issue right now. One that I recently read was a book called Co-Intelligence. This is by a entrepreneurship professor at Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. His name is Ethan Mollick, and he actually has a blog where he talks about working with artificial intelligence. it is pretty interesting because if you're not familiar with this topic, the way that we're using artificial intelligence nowadays is not how you would think we would use artificial intelligence. And I will allude a little bit to that in the discussion today. But I do think these are both very, very valid books for you to read. I'm not going to test you on these books because these are not assigned reading. At some point in the future, I may make them assigned reading. So I'm less likely to do the co-intelligence book because we're seeing so much advance in AI that what I was teaching last year is not necessarily as relevant as today. And I will try to update my notes because these are the same notes that I've been using for the past year, or actually I guess 3 semesters. But there's been a lot of change over that period of time. And so the advances in technology that we're seeing are just very, very pronounced, very, very paramount. And we're going to continue to see a very rapid pace of change. So I do think making sure that you're knowledgeable about this will be very important for everybody who's going to be going into the business world in the future. And so I would wholly recommend thinking about this. But today, we're going to talk about the superficial level, which is going to be my AIS level. And I want to talk about some things that I think you should know about with respect to how these relate to accounting information systems. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the origins of blockchain. And the origins of blockchain came from a white paper, which was called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And you probably have heard of Bitcoin before. It's considered to be the very first cryptocurrency. And so a lot of times we use cryptocurrency, we use Bitcoin synonymously, even though it is a form of cryptocurrency. There's a lot of different crypto assets out there in the market now. Then this was the origin. And you'll notice I've got by Satoshi Nakamoto, but I've got Satoshi Nakamoto in quotation marks. And the reason why is this is who it's attributed to, but Satoshi Nakamoto is not a real human being. This is a pseudonym, and the actual person or persons who this was attributed to are still unknown. A lot of people think this was something that was authored by Elon Musk, although he's denied that. They think that maybe this was the brainchild of a bunch of researchers that did not want to try to take responsibility for that whole body of work. There's a lot of speculation on this, but today this is one of the big mysteries of who Satoshi Nakamoto really is. But this white paper detailed how we can get away from our traditional currency system. So we are all very familiar with the traditional currency system. It's basically kind of a regulated banking system where we have assets that are held in a particular position, and whenever we want access to that system or to those assets, we actually ask the system, we'd like access to those assets, please provide them to us, and they are authorizing the exchange of those assets for what the transaction is. And this holds to pretty much any format that you want to talk about. If you want to talk about debit cards, you could say if you bought something at Walmart, what would the transaction look like? You basically say, I've got my debit card. This is an authorization for transfer of funds from my bank account to Walmart's. And the same holds true for a credit card, although there's a little bit more challenging with that because you're not really transferring funds. You're asking to borrow funds from a particular organization that you will eventually repay. So there's multiple stages in that transaction. Regardless, there's a particular characteristics that we've got a financial intermediary that's responsible for the business. And so we have to put trust in those financial intermediaries to make sure they're doing their job correctly. Now, trust is a hard thing to come by in this day and age, especially as we're starting to see collapses of business. We probably not too long ago, I think it was about a year ago, was the Silicon Valley Bank collapse that undermined a lot of trust in the banking system. And we continuously see problems like that, even though we try to make sure that these are as strong as possible. There's not a lot of trust in kind of the regulated system because there's so many problems that could potentially come up and so much things that oversight, or so many problems with that oversight. Which the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, that's a whole other issue that's unrelated to this, but it's still fascinating to discuss. Anyway, one of the issues with this trust-based system is the idea that people can't operate for themselves. So this white paper came up with this idea of what if we create our own currency that's on a distributed ledger system? And the idea being is that we can trade this currency between people and two parties. Because if you think about it, currency itself doesn't really have any value. If I say, all right, you have $1 million, what does that mean? And the only value that $1 million has is what you can trade in goods and services for that. Having $1 million into itself, unless you're like Scrooge McDuck and you put it to a big vault and go diving into it and swing around in the coins and the dollar bills, there's no actual utility from the money itself. It's what you can gain from the money. So they said this could be any currency, and we can exchange currency for goods and services as long as we're willing to accept that. The idea being is that we create a currency system that's based on this ledger. It also involves a resource-intensive mining, which I'll explain that because that's kind of a fascinating proof system that they developed. But the whole point is to eliminate financial intermediaries, and they actually call it middlemen in the textbook, but the term is the same. The people in the middle who kind of negotiate these exchanges, they go away. We actually do transactions between one another, as opposed to transaction between a bank or transaction here to a bank to the end party. All right, there's no middle party. It's just two one-on-one exchange. It would be online. It would use internet protocols, which would be faster with lower costs, and peer-to-peer, like I said, into individual one-on-one transactions. And most importantly, it'd be a trustless exchange, which the idea being is that we don't have to trust some financial institution to be able to regulate or to be able to manage our money for us, or manage our resources for us. We manage our own resources. That was the idea behind this, and it was a fascinating perspective. It was a fascinating perspective to take on things, and kind of set this tone for what we believe, what we have nowadays with respect to crypto assets, how we exchange these crypto assets. And that includes cryptocurrencies, tokens, any other digital assets that you might think of, all fall under this kind of policy. This was the origin of this, and this is, I believe, 2008 this came out. So it's been a concept for about 15 years, or idea for about 15 years that kind of generated to fruition now that we've seen. So let's just go ahead and compare this really quickly. Traditional transaction system is centralized, requires an intermediary for recording approval, and there's only one copy of the ledger. Now, this last one is kind of interesting because this is something that traditional businesses have always held. The accounting information system has the ledger in one spot, which creates a problem because manipulation of that ledger can occur. That's something that we see in a lot of frauds that have occurred, is that people have looked at the business, the ledger that's on the system, and they've said, I can change transactions, or I can add or illicit transactions to the ledger, and I can change the financial position of the organization. That's the big criticism about traditional accounting, is that if it's held by one individual, or a certain set of individuals, then those individuals can actually manipulate it for gain. So that's kind of our traditional transaction system. The blockchain transaction system is going to be decentralized and distributed. Okay, it's not within one organization; it's across multiple organizations, all the organizations on the blockchain. That whether that be one company or whether that be multiple companies. There's no intermediary needed. We don't actually have to have a financial institution that regulates the transactions. There's multiple copies of the ledger. It's held on every single system. The system updates synchronously, which basically means when a transaction occurs, every single party that's on the system actually has an access to that particular transaction update. And it's fully transparent. Have you all heard that term in your business classes before, the idea of transparency? Does that term come up? Hopefully it has, okay? Transparency, really, really important, okay? Having opaque transactions is not a goal that we're looking for. We're trying to make sure that everybody understands what is happening. That is actually the whole goal of financial reporting, is that organizations actually have to create these reports so that people who own the organization, have stake in the organization, can see the operations. It's supposed to be a mechanism of transparency. The blockchain system, all transactions are available to everybody on the system, so it's fully transparent, which is kind of a big deal. All right. So why use blockchain? Well, it allows multiple parties to collaborate using a shared system. So if we have one blockchain that were multiple parties upon it, all the people who are on that blockchain can operate together. It also accelerates the speed of transaction verification and settlements. Now, this is something that I think goes understated, because we're so used to electronic mechanisms that exist for us. Like we have mechanisms like Venmo and PayPal, where we immediately have transactions that go forth. That being said, there's still an intermediate step, which actually has to do with the resolution of the financial intermediary. Because there's no financial intermediary, whenever transactions take place, it immediately finishes. So it's going to be important to note. Reduces the cost associated with external verification. So this is a fascinating thing. This is one of the fascinating things that I only recently discovered, because I was not an expert in cryptography. Has anybody heard the term cryptography before? Okay. All right. I'm not going to make you experts in cryptography, but I will tell you a little bit about the nature of cryptography. So in the white paper, they came with an ingenious system. They said, we actually bribe people to verify our transactions for us. So in order to verify the transactions, they have to go through a complex series of equations. Basically, it's like solving a very complex mathematical equation. But once that equation is solved, it verifies all the transactions that are on the blockchain. So people are doing the accounting work for them. Basically, everything's put on the ledger, the verification occurs, and then whoever's responsible for verifying, they actually get what's called that's what's called mining. You probably heard of like Bitcoin mining or crypto mining. Mining is not the actual process of swinging an axe, okay, or going in there and do virtual mining. It's actually the nature of it is solving this cryptographic hash equation to verify these transactions. And once the transaction is verified, the first party that does that, they get awarded with a piece of the crypto asset. So if in Bitcoin, if you're on a Bitcoin blockchain, if you solve the Bitcoin or resolve the Bitcoin blockchain, then you get some payment in Bitcoin. And it's a decreasing algorithmic function. The original Bitcoins, like you only receive like 12 Bitcoins. Now you see or receive a fraction of the Bitcoin. But then again, Bitcoin's worth a whole lot more than it used to be when it first started. So yeah, reducing the cost of assertive verification. Basically, there's no cost. You just basically say, hey, here you go. You receive an award for your resolution, which is fascinating to me. I think that's not something I knew about until very recently, and I said that's just an ingenious method. You get people to do the work for you. Yeah. Everybody get away with that. It's like just basically sit in the AIS and says, well, I don't have to study. I can have somebody else do the work for me, and then I can just award them with a Bitcoin. That'd be great. That would be great if you get away with that. You'd reduce your chance of actually learning something in the class. Okay, but it is what it is, I guess. All right, we want to reduce our cost of central verification. We also share system transactions with all parties. That's a transparency mechanism we were talking about. And then probably one of the critical ones is that once transactions are confirmed, they cannot be altered. Remember we talked about that isolated system? We talked about that isolated system. So yeah, in the isolated system, the transactions can be altered, and we can actually note that in a standalone system that we have traditional organizations. These mechanisms are just not foolproof at all. They can actually be subject to fraudulent activity. This is going to reduce the chance of that because once you have it for confirmed transaction, it's basically imprinted forever. And all parties that are on the blockchain will know about it. All right. So here's an example of the blockchain. By the way, I do want to make a note of this, okay, because this will come up. For those of you who are looking at the textbook, you will notice that they actually talk about 3 types of blockchain in the textbook. This is a slide that I found online that I really liked, so I decided to keep it. All right. So the 3 types of blockchain they talk about in the book, I believe they talk about public, private, and consortium. But we have a 4th one called a hybrid. Okay, a hybrid basically has characteristics of both a public and a private. And so you can kind of see where there's the examples of the blockchain. A public blockchain, anybody can access. It does not have any permission system. So if you're on a public blockchain, every person who exists has potential access to that. Most blockchains are going to fall under a private blockchain, which is going to be for an organization or a organization and constituents. Then we've got a consortium blockchain, which is going to be a group of organizations that are all doing business together. This is fairly common, especially if organizations want to engage in their transactions directly with one another. And then the hybrid, as we mentioned, a hybrid actually has, it's controlled by an authority, but it has a permissionless process. So it does allow anybody to access it, but there is some sort of control oversight on the blockchain itself. So yeah, again, there's not going to be questions about all of these in the homework, but you will be responsible for knowing about all the types of blockchain with respect to the exam. So what are some opportunities in blockchain? So these are some of the fascinating things there. First of all, my personal favorite is going to be continuous auditing. So as you will learn, many of you who are in this class who are accounting majors, when you go on to take the auditing class, auditing is basically a one-time thing, at a period of time where something takes place. Usually this is going to be an annual process. So the auditor comes in at the end after the year is concluded, they do some work and they verify information and they're done, all right? With blockchain, we have the potential to actually eliminate that process, that periodic process, and do this in an ongoing process. Now, which do you think, which would provide you more confidence if you had something that occurred at one point in time or something that was ongoing? Probably the ongoing mechanism, the ongoing process, right? Yeah. So continuous auditing has the potential to actually improve confidence, which I don't know about you guys. If I improve confidence, I generally feel more confident about things. Okay, that's just my general trend. If I have more confidence, I'm more confident. Is that kind of a tautology to say something like that? I don't know. We'll move on from this. I'm gonna continue rambling otherwise. All right. Then we have smart contracts. Okay. So smart contracts. I'm not as familiar with this, but I wrote down some notes on this. So programs that start on a blockchain that run when predetermined conditions are met. I can't read my own writing, okay? So a smart contract is basically something that when a certain condition is met, it actually initiates an automatic contract. So say, for example, you have vendors who are on the blockchain with you, and they actually initiate a transaction. This blockchain actually has the ability to create a draw up a contract once they have actually met the conditions for that contract to be initiated. So instead of drafting a contract every time a transaction occurs, basically the blockchain will create that contract for you. Now, it's not a traditional contract as in what Professor Templeton probably teaches you in the law classes. A contract can be implicit, but the idea being is that if we have the conditions that are met, the transaction automatically occurs and it's initiated and it's drafted without any human intervention, which is kind of cool. Also, new job opportunities in non-traditional roles. So as we see the evolution, this is going to be true for AI as well. As we see an evolution of technology, we're going to see a lot more of the changes in what people are doing. It's no longer going to be an identification of, well, I'm a staff accountant, or I'm an internal auditor, or I work in this particular role. There's going to be a lot of overlap, and there's going to be a lot of flexibility in the kind of work that you're going to be doing. It's very interesting to hear visitors who come here to Truman State now and talk about their jobs, especially those who are very technologically integrated, because some of their job roles are not things that I've heard of before. Like you think chief information officer, that's an obvious one, but something that has to do with information that's not considered to be like an oversight role. Those are new things that are coming up that have been only fairly recent within the past few decades as technology has become increasingly more pronounced. And then probably the most obvious one is going to be the evolution of cryptocurrencies. This is one of those ones that I'm fighting against because cryptocurrencies has long been kind of held as an investment mechanism. Is anybody here invested in cryptocurrencies? Any investing in that? I mean, I had an argument with one of our former finance professors, and I'm kind of of the Warren Buffett school. I'm just like invest in stocks, and bonds, things that are going to last for a long period of time, and you hold that investment for long periods of time. You don't shift around a whole lot. And he made a very compelling argument. He says, well, of course, Warren Buffett's not going to invest in cryptocurrencies. He doesn't need to. He's got like billions of dollars. Okay. But he said that this is going to be an interesting mechanism. And there's fascination because what is a cryptocurrency? Should we treat it as an investment? Should we treat it as a cash asset? Should we treat it as an intangible asset? Which the answer is that's weird, but that's actually how FASB has actually recognized cryptocurrencies in financial statements, is treating as an intangible asset. That makes no sense to me, by the way, but that's a topic for another discussion. And the interesting thing is that we can talk about cryptocurrencies. They should be part of a blockchain, but cryptocurrencies are not held rationally. They are not held rationally. What I mean by that is that people don't necessarily invest for the purpose of trying to get rich. They invest because they want to hold cryptocurrency. And there's a few things for that. First of all, the big reason Warren Buffett talked about not wanting to hold crypto assets is that you don't generate any investment value in investing in crypto assets. It's like investing in a comic book. Okay, the comic book itself doesn't generate the value. You're just trying to hope that the comic book comes worth more in the future. All right, traditional investments, we think about if I give an investment to Walmart, they're going to take my money into Walmart, they're going to invest that into some project, and they're going to give me a return on my investment. Crypto assets don't necessarily do that. Also, there's crypto assets. It's hard to believe this. I know there's going to be crypto assets that are whimsical or even fraudulent out there. Now, the whimsical one is kind of interesting. This one right here. Okay. Does anybody know the story of Dogecoin? Has anybody even heard about this? So you probably heard of the whole idea of the Doge. Okay. That was a meme on there. It's a picture of a Shiba Inu dog that had just kind of weird face. You can see the picture of the dog right here. It was used in a lot of memes. This coin was created specifically for the purpose of making fun of people who will just invest in anything because they like it. Okay, completely, totally created to make fun of investors of crypto assets. Does anybody know the market cap of Dogecoin as of today? It's over $21 billion. Something that was created as a complete and total joke is worth $21 billion. I have not had any jokes that are worth nearly that much money. Okay. Also, there is the potential for fraud in this particular area. There was one that was really well known a few years ago. Anybody remember that TV show Squid Game on Netflix? They actually created a crypto coin. At least some people said they created a crypto coin on Squid Game. It's supposed to be the Squid Game coin, and a lot of people invested in it. And it turned out to be a gigantic scam. Once they got the money, they ran off and did not return it to any of the investors. And the investors were left with something completely worthless because it wasn't a real coin at all. They just made up a coin. Yeah, so a lot of potential opportunity for fraud that could occur out there with that. So yeah, there are definitely some challenges in that regard. With respect to other challenges we're going to talk about, um, there are important protocols not present in current regulation. I will say that a lot of countries are starting to become more active in regulation of crypto assets, but it's a slow process. So there's not really protocols surrounding speed, confidentiality, or even overall governance of crypto asset transactions or blockchain transactions. Probably one of the biggest disparities is the fact that blockchain systems are currently not compatible with other systems, okay, with enterprise systems. So like NetSuite cannot be integrated within a blockchain system, which seems to be a big problem if you're going to use a blockchain system. All right. Seems like to be a big problem if you're going to use a blockchain system is that you're not going to be able to use this with your enterprise resource planning system. Will this change in the future? Probably, but right now we're not to that point. Also, the skill sets necessary for blockchain use are lacking. So this is probably the most knowledge that you're going to gain about blockchain specifically, at least in most of your classes. I mean, some of you may have some outside activities that you do where you get a lot more exposure to this, but this is probably the maximum of that you're going to get exposed to it in class. There's not currently classes that talk specifically about how to negotiate blockchain transactions. For those of you who are in an accounting program, when you get to graduate level, Dr. Lingwall may teach you how to create a blockchain on your own. But for the most part, there's very, very limited information, very limited detail on blockchain transactions. So having the skill sets once you graduate from college, that's going to be something you have to develop on your own, which in my personal opinion is an oversight, but I'm also not in a position to fix that problem myself. And then blockchain systems are difficult to evaluate, regulate, and govern because they are so non-traditional. One of the issues that came up in the book that I was telling you about, the FTX book, is a lot of people put their trust into FTX to govern the exchanges and the crypto asset transactions. Now, when they put their trust into something, that basically means that they've got an intermediary. Does everybody remember what I was talking about? The whole purpose of a blockchain system was in the first place? To eliminate intermediaries. So basically, they created a new intermediary. It was just not the same intermediary as before. And the problem with that one is that this intermediary was completely unregulated by the US government. So when it collapsed, there was no real reprisal. There was no real way to get all of the assets back. And so certainly problematic. We can also talk about kind of some of the dark areas to talk about. The big competitor for FTX at the time was a company called Binance, which is still really popular. Changpeng Zhao, is that his name? I believe the head of Binance. They got hit with a multi-billion-dollar fine for money laundering because basically they knew people were doing these activities on their exchanges and they just kind of ignored it because they're just like, we're making so much money, we don't care. So there's certainly problems in this area. And I do think that eventually, when we talk about blockchain systems and the exchanges between blockchains, this will become more regulated, especially by all governments internationally. There's going to be a lot more oversight in this, which kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? Because the whole point is to have non-regulated exchanges. So the problem being is that how do you have a regulated exchange you can trust? The answer is it's not easy. It's a non-regulated exchange that you can trust is not easy to achieve, which is there's no good answer to that, unfortunately. All right, well, I'm sorry to leave you on the down note, but the good news is we're moving on. Okay, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, I'll probably refer to it as AI. I'm sure as many of you will. It's also called cognitive technologies. The only reason I'm mentioning that is there's a homework question that actually refers to cognitive technologies, which you will very rarely hear that term used nowadays, but that's something that was frequently used. It's computerized performance of tasks that are originally associated with human intelligence. It involves logic, rationality, visual perception, speech recognition, language translation. Now, interesting, I got this quote from the book. This is another one from McKinsey Global Institute. He said, AI can create $5.2 trillion in value across all business sectors eventually. After doing some research on this, after doing some reading on this, I think that number may actually be small. I think that number may be a little bit low. I think AI could actually represent a much larger proportion of our overall global income. But again, using this for context, we talked about this with respect to big data. Does everybody remember what I said the global GDP was last year? $100 trillion, okay? So we're talking about roughly 6% of global GDP could be tied up in AI, which is kind of scary if I'm saying that's on the low end, that number could be technically larger. But we're starting to see a lot of change, a lot of advancement in AI. So there's a rule, and I apologize for not being able to attribute the rule, but it's a rule about technology, is that technological progress will double, or basically our progress will double every 2 years, okay? So that's been a kind of standing maxim for the past few decades with respect to technological accomplishment. We're starting to see AI eclipse that pace. AI's evolution is going at a much rapid pace. It's more like 8 months that we're starting to see AI evolution double in capability. So you've probably heard of tools like ChatGPT. Has everybody heard of ChatGPT? I'm assuming so because I did a presentation on AI earlier this semester where we talked about ChatGPT. But ChatGPT was originally on version 3.5. Okay, that's where it was last year around this time. They were just starting to introduce the concept of ChatGPT 4.0. When ChatGPT 3.5 was developed, it was basically on just over 1 billion pieces of data, which is a lot of data, a lot of pieces of data. But ChatGPT 4.0 was developed on over 1 trillion pieces of data. So literally 1,000 times as much data. So if you think about that expansion, that evolution, imagine if you were given 1 piece of information and you tried to make judgments on that, and then you were given 10 pieces of information. Which would give you the better judgment, having 1 piece or 10 pieces of information? Probably 10 pieces of information. Now imagine you were given 1,000 pieces of information, okay? Probably even better judgments if you do that. So the more detail it is, the better training and the more development it is. And those numbers are only expanding. I'm sure in the future we're probably going to say that ChatGPT 5 point whatever is going to be developed on a quadrillion pieces of information or something like that. It's just going to be exponential growth in that regard. So what are some examples of AI? So one that you're probably familiar with are bots, okay? Does everybody recognize that logo? So what should I say? Hey Siri? Yeah. Yep, comes up. There we go. All right. Sorry, sorry Siri, I don't need you right now. My apologies. Yeah. So bots are a kind of early form of this, and they're very rudimentary artificial intelligence, but they're meant to be kind of assistants. You've probably seen the bots that take form for different organizations that are very, very familiar. Obviously, Apple and Siri are well known. The one for Amazon Alexa can kind of be visual, kind of personal visual assistant. Microsoft, they've actually got a few different ones now, but Microsoft was actually, they started out with one called Cortana, which for those of you who don't know Cortana was actually a reference to a video game character from the Halo series. So I thought that was kind of funny because didn't Cortana become really, really corrupt and try to destroy everything in the series? Like, that's not a really good choice for an AI assistant there, Microsoft. Not to say that Microsoft has ever made any bad choices. Yeah, anyway, next one is natural language processing, which this is also known as the bane of my existence. Okay, this is like when you go to a website and all of a sudden a virtual chat will appear and you can start asking questions. I do think that there's some value in that to be able to answer rudimentary questions more effectively. And I will say that in all probability, this will take the place of kind of the customer service that we traditionally know and love, or know and hate, depending on your perspective. That being said, we're still in the phases of development on this. However, interestingly enough, there was a company called Dukan, D-U-K-A-A-N, and they were very, very big notoriety about a year ago. So July 2023. The CEO of Dukan laid off 90% of the workforce. Okay, laid off 90% of their workforce. I actually shouldn't say the workforce, 90% of their customer service workforce. And they replaced it with a chatbot. Now, the interesting thing about that is not the change, because I think we're going to see a lot of that change, especially in the customer service sectors occur. What the fascination about that is that basically the CEO laid everybody off and was trying to be diplomatic about it, say, I apologize, we no longer need your services. Then bragged on Twitter that they basically reduced their cost by implementing a chatbot, basically reduced their cost 85% in customer service because they implemented a chatbot. Talk about the worst media fiasco surrounding trying to implement something like this. Not a good idea. Okay, so any of you who are going to go on to own your own business organizations, be very careful with what you post on social media. All right, there may be a backlash, especially if you're laying people off and then bragging about it. It's probably not a good idea. Probably not a good idea. But yeah, with respect to this, we can talk about the automated customer services systems. These will probably evolve over time, especially as AI becomes more complex. Something that's fairly established also is something called robotic process automation. And this is basically, we talk about robotic process automation. It is just what the terms sound like. We talk about mimicking human actions through a sequence of steps without human intervention. Now, these are supposed to be intended to be repetitive tasks or repetitive routines that humans perform. RPA was, when we talk about AI, It's more of an automated challenge or automated series of steps, which when we talk about anything in accounting and business, we probably have a lot of things that we could look at with the respect to the work that we do that is a little bit tedious and a little bit boring, particularly if we're writing out certain things in forms. If we get an RPA tool to do that for us and just make sure that we have some oversight over that, that can eliminate a lot of the work. This is not kind of the transformative technology that we're talking about with respect to ChatGPT or Copilot. Those are actually a different type of tool, but the RPA tools still have value into themselves, especially as they continue to evolve and take over those routines. So as a very general type of artificial intelligence with respect to ChatGPT, that's considered to be machine learning. Now, that's a very broad tool. You may say, I thought ChatGPT was a large language model. There are some overlaps in the terminology. Large language model is considered to be a model of learning, where this is a type of artificial intelligence. What's the distinction? Good question. That being said, machine learning is considered to be a form of artificial intelligence where there's at least a minimal amount of human interaction. Artificial intelligence, traditionally speaking, there has to be a certain level of supervision by humans. Machine learning kind of takes the fore in the fact that they reduce the amount of reduce the amount of human intervention. When we go a little bit further, we're going to talk about it here in just a second. We get to deep learning. There's almost no human intervention. It's the machine learning on their own. But machine learning generally involves a lot of trial and error on the part of the machine. They actually use large databases. As I mentioned earlier, for ChatGPT 3.5 was 1 billion items. For ChatGPT 4.0 was 1 trillion. They use really, really large databases to try to learn and predict what it is the necessary output may be. So let's go into a little bit more detail on machine learning, okay? So machine learning involves a computer ability to learn from experience rather than specific instructions. So as I said, less human interaction, more about the humans or the tools themselves learning from whatever their feedback is provided. It is a type of AI, and we've got an even more complex form called machine learning called deep learning. Now, deep learning is characterized by neural networks, which we're not going to go into too much detail about what a neural network is, but effectively to say that it's trying to emulate the logic systems of the human mind. So we're trying to actually make computers think like humans. So neural networks are just basically they're engines of machine learning and mathematical models that convert inputs to outputs or predictions. How we as humans think. We take information, we absorb the information, and we actually make decisions based on that. These complex multi-layered neural networks enable deep learning, which allows machines to solve sophisticated problems, but they also create significant multi-complexity. This is actually something, did anybody watch Nishant Paharia's presentation last year when last year was here last spring? So he was one of I believe our executive in residence or one of our presenters last spring. And he actually talked a lot about the nature of models of AI. So the good news is that the AI models are evolving and they're becoming more and more complex and able to make much more critical judgments and use problem-solving techniques, much like human. The problem with that is that if the inputs themselves are developed incorrectly, the models form incorrectly, and they start making judgments that are not necessarily consistent with the way a normal, rational human being works. You want to talk about the one off the deep end. This was one from a few years ago. It was Tay Talks, which I was making a joke about Microsoft not ever making mistakes. This was one of Microsoft's big fiascos. This is actually an internet bot, AI bot that was created by Microsoft. They said it was supposed to be a form of AI with no filter. So basically, it took information from all these sources that were working through Twitter, because it was posting on Twitter, and took all the information, all these sources, used that to actually determine what based on the inputs, what necessary outputs were. The problem being is that it was getting all these inputs that were very, very negative and very, very problematic, and when it provided the outputs were also very negative and problematic. I won't go into detail about this, but there was a lot of white supremacist rhetoric that Tay eventually started spewing out. There were some mentions of a former leader of Germany during World War II, okay, which I'm not going to acknowledge that name, but hopefully you know who I'm talking about, okay. That's not the kind of thing we want AI to be spewing out. We don't want that type of rhetoric happening. And so they actually had to take Tay offline, Microsoft did, which is a big fiasco. And not their only fiasco with AI. There's a lot of them out there, but that was a big one. So the problem being is these neural networks, yes, they are very complex and they allow for detailed problem solving, but they rely on making sure that the inputs are good, which is not always going to be the case. If you look at the queries on ChatGPT and Copilot, those are very heavily filtered by human intervention to prevent things that are not necessarily going to be as relevant, because it is operating from a large database, and not necessarily all of that database is going to be factual or even rational at certain points. All right, so let's talk about just kind of some basic machine learning applications and performances. So we talk about machine learnings, we can generally categorize them into two groups, and these are very broad groups, and I'm not going to do them justice, but we'll work from the point that we have. So first of all, we talk about machine learning actually seeks to do classification, which is assign labels or dividing the input into output groups. The easiest way to think about this is just a yes or no question, or a two-tiered question, one characteristic or another. All right, so like we talk about an AI spam bot that was trying to make sure that you're not receiving spam in your email filter, is trying to classify it either as spam or not spam. Spam goes in the spam folder or the junk folder, and then not spam goes to your inbox. That would be an easy way to think about classification. The other one is going to be regression, which is seeking to predict real numbers. So the price of a house or revenue next quarter. If you've ever taken a statistics class, you may actually be familiar with the concept of linear regression, which is using multiple variables to actually draw a conclusion. That's the same idea, is that a machine is doing that for us. So it's taking a large number of inputs and trying to use all those inputs to come up with the best fit for a particular line. Some easy ways to think about this. These are the machine learning applications. This is just a table that's from the book, which I really like. So two-class classification and anomaly detection. These are both forms of classification. Okay. Again, answering a yes/no question or classifying amongst two different areas. And then the last three, regression algorithms, clustering algorithms, and reinforcement learning algorithms. These are generally going to be considered regression. Now, there is some problems with that because they don't fit cleanly in either group, any of these. But for the most part, we can characterize those as one of those two types of learning models, those learning applications. Something that I think is particularly important is understanding the types of machine learning that are available. Because as we start moving down in the hierarchy here, the machine learning type tools become more powerful. They also become more unpredictable. So supervised learning is basically saying the output of a known set of values. So we provide a data into a machine learning tool. We know that the machine learning tool should come up with a certain conclusion or a certain output based on the nature of that. So we know what the output should be, and we can match that according to what the machine does. So if the machine learning tool provides the same response as what the inputs dictate that we had, then we can conclude the machine learning tool is operating effectively. Most machine learning tools start out at a supervised learning phase just to actually have basic development. But the more complex tools have moved on to some of these others. So unsupervised learning, this is using unstructured data where the output is unknown. So this creates some certain concerns because we don't know what the output should be, so we're not certain how the machine learning tool is going to respond. If we don't know what the output is, then it could be any number of different directions, and that's certainly scary with respect to how artificial intelligence evolves. We do have some what's called semi-supervised learning, which we have data are labeled, but some labels may be incorrect or missing. And basically, in this situation, this is where we try to determine whether the computer can actually make decisions on incomplete data. If that's the case, they can discern the values from the incorrect and missing outputs and still draw conclusions from it. We can say that this is a really important characteristic of trying to make artificial intelligence emulate human learning, because that's something we do as naturally as humans, all right? So for example, you're trying to make a decision of whether you want to take an umbrella or wear a coat. If you don't necessarily have all the information to make that decision, you can still make an educated guess. We've already heard that term educated guess many times in our lives. This is something we're trying to get AI systems to do themselves. So a machine learning tool that can actually make that educated guess and make decisions based on incomplete information can be very powerful in trying to emulate what we do as our tasks that we do as humans. And then we also have reinforcement learning. Now, I wanted to make a note here before I go to reinforcement learning. None of these are necessarily mutually exclusive, okay? I would say probably supervised and unsupervised learning are the most mutually exclusive, but there may be elements of all of these in a machine learning tool. That being said, reinforcement learning is probably the most familiar of these. This is basically learning by trial and error. So a machine does something incorrectly, and it's prompted that this is incorrect, and so it learns from that. This is largely how ChatGPT 3.5 was developed, to how it evolved, because it had such a small subset of information. I say small, it had 1 billion data points, but if you think about that in the context of the entire planet, that is a small amount of data. So It basically came up with the best output it could, and frequently that output was incorrect. What happened was is the users prompted it and said that output is incorrect. The actual answer is this, and it learned from that process. It was a trial and error process. So fascinating perspective to take when you talk about machine learning is that definitely earlier models are going to be very heavily reliant on trial and error, particularly for user input. That being said, trial and error does have its own dangers, especially if the machine learning tool is correct and somebody tells it, no, you're incorrect, here's why, but gives them the wrong information. This is something that Dr. Caden and I actually explored with, just on a whim. We tried to say, all right, if ChatGPT says something correct, can we get it to agree to something that's incorrect? And the answer was sadly, yes, we actually could, okay? We actually could get it to agree something is incorrect. We haven't been doing that for a very long time, but for earlier versions, it was very easy and very straightforward to do. Not to say that I'm trying to make Dr. Nefarious out as a nefarious figure, but you guys be your own judges, okay? You bring your own judges. So this comes back to what the goal is when we talk about this. And so I was trying to come up with a good way to kind of wrap this up. And well, I just basically said, let me ask ChatGPT. So what are some things that it needs to know? There was a large, big blurb that ChatGPT gave me. And you know what? ChatGPT seems to always do this, even though I say the word brief every single time. So maybe I need to be more clear when I say brief, I want a certain number of sentences. Although I have in the past said to ChatGPT in 5 sentences or less, and it gave me 17 sentences. So it's not necessarily good at following detailed instructions, especially if you provide numeric clarification. Which is interesting because you'd think that a machine learning tool, math would be its best objective, but for large language models, mathematical accuracy tends to be a real problem. Interestingly, though, but I did want to point out one thing that I think was very important, that you do need to be note that even ChatGPT should know that there's going to be a transformative impact AI on the accounting profession in the field of AIS. And so this is something that a lot of professionals have been talking about in this area. And I think I probably mentioned this already in this course, but I'm going to say it again, is that you will not lose your job to AI. This is not something that a lot of professionals have told us. And I know you were saying, well, Dr. Barnes, you just mentioned about how a whole bunch of customer service professionals lost their jobs to AI. And I said, yes, that's true, okay. But your skill set is going to be really, really important, especially if you have a critical thinking skill set. One thing that was noted by Ethan Mullick, that author of that book that I told you about at the beginning of the lecture, is that he's saying that currently machine tools, machine learning tools can operate within the top 8% of any field that they work within, that they're specialized in. That still means that there's 10%, or about, I shouldn't say 8%, there's still 8% that are better than a machine learning tool. Having that level of expertise is going to make you the person in the middle. It's going to make you the person who's knowledgeable about a particular task. If you are skilled in a particular area, then the machine is going to have to learn from you. They're going to need somebody who's got that rational judgment and that problem-solving skills and the critical thinking identity. So you're not going to lose your job to AI, but people who cannot use AI will lose their jobs to people who can use AI. So I don't know what you've heard from other instructors. I don't know what you've heard on AI. There are definitely going to be some instructors here at Truman State that are going to tell you, do not use AI tools for my course. And I respect that, even if I don't agree with it. I'm going to tell you right now, get very, very accustomed to using AI tools to the degree that you can. I'm not going to say if somebody tells you in a course you cannot use an AI tool that you should just ignore that information. Obviously, respect what the instructor is. But if you've got an instructor like me that says use the AI tools to the best of your ability, go wild, okay? Not necessarily because it will help you in this course, but because it will help you in your life, all right? It will help you in your life. And then any other words of inspiration for the students, okay? So what are some things that they said? Said embrace change, make sure you focus on lifelong learning, become problem solvers, ethical integrity, okay? Be honest, all right? Collaborate with others, strong impact society, resilience, innovate, career evolution, and finally, passion, because AIS, passion is a very passionate topic, okay? All right, have a wonderful day. See you all on Wednesday.